And you probably got that loud, useful thing in your head there to say that this meeting is being recorded. So just my slideshow is doing a weird thing, so bear with me just now till I sort this. Okay, it doesn't want to go into full screen, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to... Okay, so as I mentioned, this is the Climate Anxiety webinar. This is part of the Climate Challenge Fund webinar series. So this is the 7th webinar, I believe. We've done previous webinars such as reaching and engaging your audience, talking about collecting carbon data via apps, and things like repair and reuse. We have 2 more webinars coming up after this. So we have shared transport, which is taking place next Thursday, next Wednesday, which is the 9th of June. And then the final webinar will be on adaptation to climate change, which will be the 16th of June. If you've not managed to book onto these webinars at all, I have created additional spaces. So I'll pop the link in the chat just so you've got a reminder of where that link is to sign up. Again, if you've not already signed up for these events, we have created more spaces. So really, I guess climate anxiety is a very difficult topic to talk about. It is something that we are seeing more and more, particularly in young people. And the physical impacts of climate change is very hard to ignore those things. So it's hard to ignore that we're experiencing heat waves and then the impact that causes to our physical health, whether that be through heat stress, or we're experiencing more flooding events. So people are losing perhaps their livelihoods because their business insurance rates are far too high, or they've lost their personal possessions. And similar to forest fires. So those things are difficult to ignore. But what's not really spoken about much is the mental impact that climate change has on us. So with the impacts that we're seeing and experiencing now, and what we're likely to experience in the future, and all the information we're being bombarded with, we appreciate that this is probably likely to strike some sort of level of fear amongst us. I know it's something when we do the carbon literacy training and we talk about why it's happening and the impacts, that's something it's a very negative thing to talk about. It's a very negative thing for participants to listen to as well. So is there a possibility of creating space in training courses to talk about, how people are feeling and their mental health? So today's agenda, we might be finished just before 2, and that creates some space for questions. But just on the agenda today, just a discussion around our fears surrounding climate change and what you think kind of climate anxiety means. So we'll be doing that next. Looking at what is climate anxiety. So what is the kind of definition behind it, and I'm bringing in some of what experts are saying about climate anxiety. I've got a document that I'll be able to share with you after this session. I'll email it to you all as a follow-up. How do we manage it? That's a difficult thing, and we've only got an hour, so it'll be a very brief kind of summary of how do we manage this anxiety. We'll go into a breakout discussion where we'll ask you to talk about, how can we support our communities or our colleagues dealing with climate anxiety. I'd love to get your thoughts around this, and it gives you a good chance to kind of decompress in a breakout room with others and chat about that. Then we'll get some feedback from the breakout room. So don't worry, this part on the agenda will not be recorded. We will pause the recording at this, or stop the recording at this section, as that is the last part. And then we'll have a question and answer session. So after the breakout discussion and feedback, if you've got any questions or thoughts or reflections, comments, then we'll be here to kind of answer or talk through those points. Okay, so kicking off with the first point is, the first question is, what do you think is meant by climate anxiety? So please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat there, which Jane will tell me if there's anything coming through, or just unmute yourself and shout out. Just bear in mind that this has been recorded, so if you do choose to shout out, it will record your voice as well, but it'll not record your name in terms of who's speaking. So what do you think is meant by the term climate anxiety? Don't know if we have anything in the chat there, Jane.
Yes, we've got depression, feeling of doom and gloom, and hopelessness, which I think is, all of those descriptions are very apt.
Definitely. And it's probably something that most people will be feeling when you're talking about climate change and its impact, as those points. Anybody else want to? Oh, I think we're having things coming through in the chat there. I'm getting some flashes.
Yes. There's quite a few coming through. It's fear of the unknown, fear of the future, how we're going to be affected now, how we're going to be affected in the future. I think it's also perhaps the overwhelmingness of it, that it's such a big problem, and how do we as individuals deal with it?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a hard one. That's a completely kind of natural reaction to what we're dealing with and what we're facing. I'll just leave some more space to for any more chats that come through before I go on to the next discussion point.
A couple more points. The fear of the lack of control, and being unable to identify ways of reducing our carbon footprint due to the lack of alternatives or affordability or other people's behaviours, in the sense that we want to do things, but we can't, sometimes are constrained from doing things that are going to make any positive action, and feelings of powerlessness, I think, again coming through.
And really good points, and I think what you're saying there really sums up what this climate anxiety is. I'll pick more of the chat points at the end of the session. I'll probably save it because there'll be some really good points that you're raising that, and it'll be good to keep those. So the second discussion point is, what is your biggest fear in relation to climate change? And I think some of the points were kind of raised there, the feeling of powerlessness, hopelessness. So space for some more points. So again, feel free to pop your biggest fear into the chat, or unmute yourself and let us know. I think whilst we're waiting for things to come through, I mean, I'm happy to share my biggest fear, and my biggest fear is definitely, is there enough? That their scientists are saying there is still time to act, but my biggest fear is we won't actually get there unless some really drastic actions are taken by global government. So I think I'm hopeful for COP26, but that is my biggest fear.
I think that's coming through on the chat as well. People not realising the issue or wanting to ignore it, and or buying in from the general public will come too late to make a difference. Yes, I think that seems to be the main thing coming through the chat.
Yeah.
And fear for our children as well. Obviously, our children and our children's children.
Absolutely. Those are some definitely big fears. Is what is it going to look like for the future, for children now as they become young adults and older adults? What is the planet going to look like for them? And I guess it's one of the decisions that's factored into my decision to not have children. Is you know, this future, what is that going to look like? I don't want to bring children into a world where, you know, there is no action and we've done nothing and we've ruined the planet, basically. I think that's just a real big fear. I think a couple more things came in there, Jane. So before
yes, another good point about working with people in the community and how difficult it is to convince them to take big steps when they don't feel like the powers above are also doing that, i.e. corporations and governments aren't making any significant changes. So it's harder for individuals and communities to feel that what they're doing is worthwhile. And also recognizing the lack of natural resources to support our future and what the future will look like. And that is a huge unknown and can be very scary, I guess.
Yeah. Definitely, it is very difficult to think, you know, how can my little action that I'm taking, you know, be part of the bigger picture in the grand scheme of things when you've got businesses that aren't acting on climate change. It's that kind of fairness issue, you know, why should I do something if so and so is not doing something? And I guess also our brains are hardwired to kind of only think about the short term rather than the long term. So it's difficult when we're talking about the science and saying, right, this is going to happen in the next maybe 20, 30 years if we don't act. And it's very difficult for us to see that kind of long-term path. So that action becomes difficult due to our brains being hardwired to that kind of short-term gains and short-term actions. Okay, well, I'll move on to the next point, kind of addressing, you know, what climate anxiety is. We've raised some really good points in that discussion in the previous slide, but I just picked up this definition from the Lancet back last year. They wrote a report around climate anxiety, and they defined it as, you know, referred to as eco-anxiety, climate distress, climate change anxiety, or climate anxiety. And it's basically describing the anxiety that people feel in relation to the threat of environmental disaster and the climate crisis that we are experiencing. So that's something I'll pop a link to in your emails as well. It's a very, very short report. You don't need a code or anything to access it. I think it's like a 2-pager on climate anxiety. But it's interesting that medical journals are starting to pick these things up. Even though at the moment climate anxiety isn't recognised as a clinical issue, it's more falling under the general term of anxiety. Climate anxiety is relating really to a more natural reaction to what the climate crisis is showing us. So, I mean, if you have done any research on climate anxiety, you might be familiar with this lady, Caroline Hickman. So she's an eco-psychotherapist. And she, you know, as I said, it is a natural reaction. And she's stating that eco-anxiety is a legitimate reaction to the climate crisis and is mentally healthy to feel this way. It's very difficult when you care about the planet to not have some sort of distress and feel, you know, the sadness that brings over what's happening. And a lot of climate psychologists say that we should create a space for eco-anxiety, climate anxiety. And creating that space is creating that ability to be able to talk about how we're feeling about this. You know, what can we do to kind of feel better, manage that anxiety, and, you know, whilst taking action on climate change. And also, failure to turn anxiety into agency can tip to this term called ecophobia. That's basically where you feel that there is no action that can be taken to solve the climate crisis. So that's something at extreme end that you wouldn't want to go into, as that more then results in, well, you'll sit back and not take action because you're too scared to do anything about the crisis. Oh, and that's just a repeated slide for some reason. So in terms of how climate anxiety manifests itself, you know, and the various research pieces, papers that I've looked at, these are kind of some of the common things that come up in terms of it manifesting. And also these are things that you've picked up, that's been picked up in the chat that you've popped in when we spoke about what does climate anxiety mean. So feelings of hopelessness, like there's nothing that you can do, that you're just one person in the bigger picture. A feeling of anger, so when you're seeing people not act or businesses not acting and new coal mines being opened, you think, why is that happening when we've got a climate crisis on our hand? So it feeds into that anger and frustration as well. So you just, you know, can't understand why this is happening. Existential dread as well, that's something that's completely normal. You know, it's that feeling of, well, hopelessness, dread, what is the future going to look like? Another common thing as well is guilt or shame, and that could be relating to your own carbon footprint. So if you've done that carbon footprint calculator, you might be shocked and feeling ashamed of what, you know, your footprint actually is. So these are all completely normal. And panicking as well, so that hopelessness again could feed into the panic. You know, is there enough time to act? Will we be able to act? And so on. Grief and sadness too. So we're seeing a lot of destruction happening, the loss of habitats, some species on the red list as they're at risk of becoming extinct due to climate change. And if we look back to the Australian wildfires, the amount of biodiversity that was lost as a result of that, for, you know, people all around the world, but particularly in communities that were suffering this, that is a huge issue and a huge feeling of grief and sadness for these communities. So I'll stop here for reflection. Those kind of things, hopelessness, anger, frustration, those points I've outlined there, you know, how many of these have you experienced? Feel free to pop again things in the chat or unmute yourself and shout out. I think, do we have some comments?
Yes,
there?
yes. I think most people are saying probably felt all of them at one point or the other. And also the point being made about young people, which I think you made earlier as well, about young people experiencing climate anxiety, perhaps more so than older people. Despair and hopelessness about the future of humanity, who are, and they're younger, and it's more difficult perhaps for them to take significant action and or understand or comprehend what's going on. So kind of a fear for young people, but it's coming through that everybody's feeling some elements of anxiety, if not all of them.
Yeah, it's difficult not to feel all of those things. And that kind of future, if you think back to maybe when you were younger and you thought about, you know, what does the future look like? And well, I'm a child of the 90s, and when I thought about the future, it was, you know, flying cars and, you know, robots taking over and robots doing everything. But now when you ask young people, what does our future like? It's a more dystopian society, and it's a disturbing picture that the young people are painting, showing that, you know, this anxiety is a real issue amongst young people. So I don't know if, did anything else come in there in the chat? I've seen a few flashes on my screen there, but
it was just agreeing with the points you've raised of how it manifests itself.
Yeah. Okay, so really moving on to kind of the last part of my presentation before we hand over to you in breakout rooms and have a discussion about how we support our communities and colleagues, is, you know, the what can we do about it? And very similar to maybe some of the points here that I'll raise is very similar to, you know, what can we do about the climate crisis itself. But firstly, we need to acknowledge this anxiety that we're feeling and talk about it. So providing some sort of outlet and support to people that are feeling this point. You know, particularly, you know, your communities, you'll have a lot of young people there, and, you know, is it possible to provide spaces for, you know, groups for young people to come together and talk about this issue and talk about, you know, how can we deal with it. Taking action on climate change is something that can make us feel, although, you know, going back to the points you were raising earlier, where you felt hopeless about doing anything about it. In fact, doing some actions can make you feel good and lead on to taking more actions. It can actually kind of, you know, and not stop the anxiety, but it certainly help with you coping with it. And educating yourself and others. So many of you I know will have been through our climate emergency training, and there's courses on that. There's other courses about, I think, climate anxiety. And again, there's another link I'll send to you in the email, and that is Eventbrite's climate change events coming up this month. I think there's one about mental health and the climate crisis. So I'll send you that link, because that looks like a really useful topic. And also in educating others as well. So talking about climate change and talking about what actions your communities can take, which you're all already doing anyway. So just keep on keeping on, basically. And look for inspiration, or be the inspiration. So if you're wanting to be the inspiration, do case studies around what you're doing, or blogs, and sharing those on social media and showing others what you're doing is making a difference. Or look into what other communities are doing about it as well. So for example, on our website, we've got our climate heroes. So a group of volunteers that have been recognised for their contribution to their communities and carbon reduction there. So there's some really inspiring stories from our climate heroes. So do check that out on our website too. And also, it's always helpful to connect with other communities or organisations. We've seen a lot in this year. So COVID has given us a lot more things to worry about. But we've seen a lot of communities, a lot of CCF communities connecting with each other and maybe delivering certain aspects of the project together. So I really recommend, you know, connecting with others and creating that space where we talk about it. And I found this, I seen this article earlier this week, and this is kind of on the action front. And it was a group of young people in New South Wales and Australia. They were really concerned about the extension to a coal mine in New South Wales, and obviously the impact that would have on the planet, and further exacerbating the impacts of climate change. So whilst unfortunately the court ruling wasn't that they weren't going to stop the extension to this coal mine, the court did rule that the Environment Minister in Australia had a duty of care to protect young people from climate change and its harmful effects. And the experts are saying that this could set an important legal precedent, because what that could mean is in the future, where these young people are impacted by climate change severely or causing severe mental distress, that can open the floodgates to these the owners of these coal mines being sued in another form of class action on that. So whilst unfortunately didn't stop the extension of this coal mine, it is showing how a group of 8 young people, how much change that they were able to achieve from that. So don't ever, and I suppose it's putting that message out there, don't ever doubt how much change one or a group of people can have. I mean, even look at Greta Thunberg as well. One young girl striking on a Thursday or at her school, one person turning that into a global movement. That is really inspiring, and that's when I'm talking about find inspiration or be that inspiration, because that can be hugely helpful as well. Okay, before we go on to the breakout session, I just wanted to stop for any questions or thoughts or comments before we pop you all off to discuss the next point. So again, Jane, let me know if anything's come through in the chat there.
Just another comment, just to say, as well as kind of worrying about the impact on ourselves, we're also, it's a concern for those who are going to be directly impacted by climate change.
Yeah.
You know, obviously people live with flooding or small islands, hot countries, and not just people, the wildlife as well. So it's the direct impact that it will have on nature as a whole that is of a deep concern.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, you know, we are seeing these things, and maybe in certain communities in the UK that we're not exactly seeing how climate change impacts us, but you do see how it impacts other communities across the globe, and is that fear for these people as well. And it's a, you know, completely other topic that we touched on in our climate emergency training, and that is, you know, the topic of climate justice. But yeah, I think in terms of, you know, action, just another point I wanted to make, because that comment made me think about this, is when we're not actually physically impacted by it, or maybe mentally impacted by climate change, we're unlikely to take any of the actions. It's very similar to what we're seeing with COVID. You see a lot of people saying, well, I don't know anybody that has had COVID, or none of my family have had it, so therefore it doesn't exist. That's similar to the climate change and climate change impacts. There are kind of those feelings that, well, it's not affecting me, it's not affecting my family, you know, why should we care? And that's just an unfortunate position from people to think about. Okay, so I'm going to pop you into breakout rooms. A discussion for around 15 minutes is how can we best support our communities in terms of climate action. So what I'll do is I'll pop into breakout rooms at various points and just see how the discussions are progressing. And if groups are finished with those discussions before the 15 minutes, then I'll bring us all back to talk about it. But basically, how can we best support our communities on the climate anxiety front? Is there any groups that can be set up, or any kind of actions that can be taken? I'm really keen to hear your thoughts. So I am going to stop the recording, as there's no more in terms of information from myself. It's just really the feedback from the breakout discussion and any questions you have at the end. So you'll get a notification in your ear again when I click this button.